All right, the last module of this course. Unfortunately, it's about time to go, but there's one thing I want to touch on, and that's reuse. We've spent a lot of time in this course talking about how Ansible works. For example, looking at modules that are rather low-level constructs that allow us to configure a specific aspect of our system, like to set our Git configuration. The sky's the limit. There's 1,000 of those modules in the core. You can think of those as Legos or building blocks. That's one dimension of reuse because you can plug that into a new playbook and run with it. Ansible has other types of blocks, if you will. For example, we spent a lot of time looking at plugin types in this course. We saw inventory, connection, module, lookup, become. There's also callback cache strategy and other plugins that form the core of Ansible. So the core is composed of plugins, and then we can use those plugins. We can even write our own if we want to and use community plugins. So this is another dimension of blocks or type of blocks that we can use. I find it very helpful to think about blocks when it comes to the constructs inside of Ansible and building up from those smaller foundations. So keep this in mind. And I say that because you really should just think of these as generic blocks that could be stitched together for different situations. And if you think in that way, you'll better be able to understand what exactly it entails a role and a collection, which is what I want to talk about in this module. Both of these, roles and collections, are ways of composing these lower level blocks because sometimes you want something a bit bigger than a module. Often you're going to find yourself wanting something higher level than just configuring Git, or copying a file, or creating a Docker container, or installing a package of software. You want to compose together instances of those, and we've already seen how we can do that with playbooks by adding multiple tasks that call out to different modules in this course, and sometimes use different plugins. But sometimes when it comes to writing a playbook, you don't want to have to start from scratch at a very low level, and would rather start at a higher level, somewhere between a playbook and some of these lower level blocks. And that's where roles and collections and ansible-galaxy can help you out. Now, it is worth noting that you could simply copy and paste playbooks or share playbooks somehow, and that would achieve a means of distributing your content to reuse it for yourself or for other people. That is, after all, what I did in this course to give you example files. But fortunately, that's not the only way you can go about this with Ansible. And that's where Ansible-Galaxy comes in. In a way, you can think of Galaxy as the distribution means of sharing your content. And then we have roles and collections, which are a second take on roles, is how I like to think of them. A roles v2, if you will, a second pass at it. It's a very recent addition to Ansible, so watch for changes to come to even collections to make them even better than they are today. They are just released with Ansible 2.8, which was not released that long ago. Anyways, roles and collections are what you're sharing, and they're a construct that you can think of as a little bit higher than a playbook. In fact, collections can give you a means of sharing playbooks. First up, I'd like to take a look at Ansible-Galaxy itself. This is a website that hosts a GUI where you can browse through roles historically and now collections. There are two different takes on basically the same thing, a package, if you will, for Ansible. And you know how it is. Every single platform on Earth, whether it be Ansible with Galaxy, or Node with NPM, or maybe Ruby with Ruby Gems, or .NET with NuGet, you name it. Every platform on Earth has some sort of means of distributing high-level content for reuse purposes. And that's exactly what Galaxy is. And that's one of the best ways to think about Ansible Galaxy. And if that's all you take away from this module, that is a win. So spend some time out here and peruse around on your own, and let's take a little bit of a look together just to get you started. on a high level, I like to divide up the tasks that you might perform when it comes to working with Galaxy into a series of further investigation of what Galaxy is capable of and deepening of your understanding. And the very first level is just searching for packages to see what exactly is out there. And so you can come to this search page right on galaxy.ansible.com, click this search icon, and then come out here and put whatever you'd like in this search text box. There are also filters that you can enable, different types of filters that you can apply for different metadata about roles and collections that are hosted here on Galaxy. I could type in, for example, git config, and the very first result comes back as a role. There are 24 results. I could click on this if I'd like to know more about this particular one. I even get a nice little string here that I can copy that contains a command that I could run to pull down this role onto my machine to be able to use it. Before I go too far, I'd like to point out you need to be careful with what you pull down off of Galaxy. As with any package management system and distribution platform, you should be very careful that you know what exactly you're running to make sure you're not running malicious code. It's always possible. And to better understand that, let's pull this down and take a look at what this package contains. So I want to delineate that we have performed the first step, which is just finding content that you might want to reuse from Galaxy. Okay, so once we've found a role or a collection that we'd like to use, we can copy the installation string, or we could just hop over to the command line and start working with the ansible-galaxy command. We could start out by just getting the help for this. And if we do this, you can see there are two types of content that it works with, primarily right now. Who knows what the future may hold, maybe further types. We have collections and roles. Now, roles are more of your legacy type. You're going to see much more right now when you first watch this course, if you watch it closer to when it's produced. Much more content on Galaxy that is a role. Going forward, though, I do believe you're going to see a lot more collection content. So these are two subcommands that you can work with to the ansible-galaxy command line command that can work with the Galaxy website, more or less, or the Galaxy repository of content or packages or collections or roles or whatever you want to call them. We have this command that we copied from the website, and notice that it doesn't contain anything here about role or collection. That's because historically speaking, roles were all there were. So it's kind of the default, but you could also add in a role here. Before I do that, I want to pull up the help for this and show you that there's a whole subset of sub-commands that can work with roles when it comes to Ansible-Galaxy command line utility. You can see there are quite a few role actions that we can perform. And if I up arrow and change this to a collection instead, grab the help for that, you can see we have some separate actions for collections. Fewer than we have for roles and slightly different. Perhaps over time we'll see this list expand. I don't know. This actually seems rather sufficient. If you look at what both of these contain, they'll both have some sort of init to generate the skeleton of a new role or collection if you want to create your own. After you've developed it, you take your skeleton, you plug in your code, and then you would build your package or collection artifact in this case, publish it to Ansible-Galaxy, and then somebody else can be on the consuming side, just like us, to install said collection that you've shared with the world. Maybe you are the person that benefits from this collection by using it in another project. If you come up to the role actions, you'll see similar sub-actions as well as more. You'll have init. Once you log in, you'll have the ability to publish roles. And then on the consumption side, you can go ahead and install roles. And then you have a few more commands to help you out with the removal of roles that you've installed from your machine, as well as deleting them from Galaxy. You also have a list to show you what you have installed on your machine. And then there's a search function to help you search for roles right here from the command line. And you even have an info role action. So we could even run this for our role that we just found if we want to look at it from the command line. And it's going to be the same stuff that you would see online in a much more terse command line format. In fact, you could even run this through some sort of formatter to make it look a little bit prettier. And I could run it, for example, through BAT and specify YAML as the language to get some nice syntax highlighting of the information that comes back about this role. As you can see here, just a general description is available that this configures git config and git ignore on a global level. There's a ton of metadata here about this particular role. For example, we could also see the license, the issue tracker where we could report bugs, perhaps a GitHub repository where we can get the source, how many times it's been downloaded, as well as other information that you might be interested in. Take note that, for example, there's a minimum Ansible version that specifies the minimal version of Ansible that you'll need to be able to use this role. So I can quit out of that. And I think that's a good first take on looking at the command line help for roles and collections. Next, let's go ahead and install our role. Okay, so the very first thing I'd like to do is show you what's installed on my machine before I go adding anything to it. Now, a couple ways we could do this. The long and the short is to use the list sub-action of the role sub-command for ansible-galaxy to show us what's installed. And as you can see here, we get a bunch of warnings because in the paths that it's looking at, there is nothing available. And that should be because at this point, we don't have any sort of roles installed on our system. Probably a pretty common path to look at is this user folder in the .ansible folder and then the roles subfolder. So I can also just browse the file system here. Start with my home directory and the .ansible folder. And you can see we don't even have the roles subfolder. So obviously nothing's installed at this point as far as roles are concerned. Ansible keeps a lot of files inside of this .ansible folder. You can look in here to learn quite a bit about what's going on with Ansible. For example, temp, and this is an aside, but I thought I'd point it out. Temp is a place where you can look at files that are kept post the execution of Ansible or Ansible Playbook to diagnose what happened on a given machine, both if you executed things locally or if you executed things remotely on managed nodes. You could have configured Ansible with keep remote files, set it to true, and then you could come out here to this temp folder to see those files and take a look at exactly what Ansible is doing and perhaps troubleshoot if something was going wrong or just maybe learn a little bit more about what exactly Ansible does to execute a module. That's a great challenge for you to work on your own. If you wanted to know how to enable files to be kept, where would you look here at the command line to learn a little bit more? This is where we might choose to use that Ansible config list command. And then inside of here, look for the word keep. And there is a keep remote files configuration setting. It defaults to false. You can set this to true if you wanted to enable it. And you could do that by setting an environment variable or perhaps configuring in any file. The key then is keep remote files, and then the section you put it in is defaults, and then set that to true, just like we did when configuring the inventory location. All right, so let's quit out of the configuration listing, and let's get to the heart of it. Let's install that role already. So I can paste that string that I copied, and I need to be very careful about this before I execute this role. I could at least inspect it this way. Probably better to inspect it by looking at any source code that might be available online. So out on the Galaxy website, you can click to follow to the GitHub repository, which is probably going to be pretty common for most roles that you encounter. And you could look at what purports to be the source code for this particular role. It is important to mention that this source code may not be what actually is contained by the role that you download from ansible-galaxy. That's just the way things are. Roles and collections are published to ansible-galaxy for distribution. So that publishing process is an opportunity for tampering. GitHub might have an apple and you might download an orange from ansible-galaxy. Okay, back at the command line, I've opened up a new tab here to show you that you can include the verbosity flag when it comes to the ansible-galaxy command and repeat the V to increase the verbosity. We might just run this the very first time without any verbosity and then add some verbosity if we'd like to see a little bit more and learn a little bit more. So if I were to run this again, we've already installed this, so there's not much output here. Quick quiz. What could I do to get rid of what I just installed if I would like to when it comes to roles? Well, remember there was a remove option, not to be confused with delete. And you can see I have successfully removed it. And also remember, it's probably a good idea to add the word role in here, just to be very explicit about what it is that you're installing or removing, not to just leave it as implied that it is a role. If we could run that again if we wanted to. It's not installed, so we're skipping it. Maybe if I drop the V off, let's see what we get. Okay, so we don't get a ton of extra information, but don't forget we can always get a little bit of diagnostic information. Great for learning purposes. Yes, just like with any other Ansible command. With that said, I am curious, is there a subfolder under the .ansible folder for roles now that we've installed one? There probably is, because why would you get rid of that once you've created it? So look at that. We do have our roles folder. And because we've removed roles, there's nothing inside of it. Lists out all the files, which is just ls-al. That's what LA does for an alias on my machine. There's absolutely nothing inside that roles directory. Okay, so we've downloaded the role that is named getconfig. Here is where we are downloading it from. Notice it is a tarball that is then extracted for us into the roles folder of the .ansible folder into this cosi.getconfig folder. So we could look at this on disk if we wanted to. Last output here shows us that the version was 101 that we installed, and it was installed successfully. I always like to look on disk. It's a fun way to learn. So here's the after point. Aha, there we go. We've got a folder for getconfig. And of course we could drill into this further, take a look at the contents. Maybe it would be more appropriate to take a look at the tree view. And there you go. We've got our contents of the role that we pulled down. So let's look at this next. Okay, so there's quite a bit here. I'm not going to get into all the nuances of this. What I'd like to do is show you some documentation to help you out with that, because it's something you should explore on your own some more. So back out on the ansible-galaxy website, upper right corner is a nice link here to the documentation. Click that and boom. You're right into this pretty style of content for Ansible documentation. This is a separate set of documentation from what we've been working on throughout most of this course that is nuanced or specific to Ansible Galaxy. Notice in the URL, we're at galaxy.ansible.com/docs if you'd like to browse directly to this. And over on the left-hand side contains some of the categories of documentation. So we've already performed finding content. There is more documentation here about how you can find or search for content and apply different filters and whatnot. Peruse this at your own liking. I think you can figure it out on your own. And there's also some information about roles versus collections. And notice in the roles information section of the documentation that there is what looks like what we have, if I were to put this side by side with what we downloaded for our particular role for Git configuration. These listings look pretty much the same. There's a lot of overlap. So this might start to help you understand some of this structure for roles. Oh, and notice how Ansible Galaxy is a responsive website. As I split the screen here, we go into a more mobile-like interface with a menu that can pop out if we'd like to move into a different section of the documentation. For example, using content. It'd like to know which one we'd like to use, either roles or collections. We're on roles right now, so we can click that. And voila, look at this, a whole lot of information about roles. I would strongly encourage you to read through this and just reference back to this because once again, this is something you're not going to remember all of, and that's perfectly fine. Remember it and learn it as you go, evolve your understanding of it. You'll probably absorb this a little bit more than the thousands of modules that are available, but give yourself some time. Also notice this is available for collections as well. Another link that takes you to using collections. And this is actually nested out inside of the Ansible documentation. And in this case right now, because it's so new, is pointed at the development version of the documentation.
So I might flip this over by switching devil in the URL to latest. We'll pull the latest version of documentation corresponding to the latest version of Ansible. Because this has been released now, so we don't need to look at the development documentation. That other link just probably needs to be updated. And here you go. Here's a whole set of information about using collections. I will say, though, the documentation for collections is rather sparse at this point in time. I think it'll flush out over time as they are fleshed out in terms of features, but don't be surprised if you might have to dig through some of the source code of Ansible to find what it is you're looking for, or maybe do some experimentation like I did with the Docker events command in the last module to learn more about how collections work. Perhaps the most notable example of that is under the developing collections. If you take a look at the playbooks directory, because you can nest playbooks inside of a collection, you'll find the word TBD in here. So that's not very helpful when it comes to documentation. It's perfectly fine. The stuff will get added over time. You also find TBD under tests. I do wonder if there's anything extra in the devil version of the documentation. And no, we're not any further along in terms of playbooks and tests directories. So the nice thing here is this documentation will tell you a little bit about some of the folders that you found here on the left-hand side. Now this is for collections right here on the right-hand side. If I go back a couple of times, we can get to the roles documentation. And if you're curious about what any of these things mean, for example, I could pull up if I was curious about meta. And if I'm lucky, I'll find some information here about that meta folder, and I do. There is a main file. This happens to be talking about dependencies, which is a great topic to just touch on briefly. The nice thing is Ansible roles and collections can have dependencies, which means they can be dependent on other roles or collections. A compositional technique as well, which makes them more or less composed of themselves. So very high-level construct that can be circularly referencing in terms of pointing back to its own type of information, not just composed of low-level blocks, but high-level blocks as well. So in this case, roles can be dependent on roles. And when a role is installed, any dependencies are automatically installed as well. So that's pretty helpful. I didn't see any in our case, but perhaps you'll see that if you are perusing through and downloading some various roles to try things out. Always a nice feature to have when it comes to some sort of distribution or package management system like ansible-galaxy is. Because if there's no way to specify that by the author of a role, in this case, then you, the consumer, have to specify those dependencies, and that can become a nightmare when you have dependencies of dependencies and you have versioning and yucky. Okay, so we have our role contents listed out here. Let's briefly take a moment and look through this because I think it's really important that you know what exactly is contained inside of a role before you're using it. Using things without knowing what they do, two big problems. First off, security. You could have code that's got malintent that you're going to be executing on your system. Or second off, you just have code that you don't know what it's doing executing on your system, configuring your system in a way that you don't expect it to. So look through the contents of these roles before you use them. They're high-level concepts, so they're going to contain a lot of code in them at the end of the day, a lot of configuration in them at the end of the day. And so it can take some time to peruse through them and find ones that are worth your time. I like to think of ansible-galaxy as a great way to learn sometimes, and sometimes that's all it is. And other times it is a great way to find code that you can reuse, or maybe just use it as a means to reuse your own code, or reuse code that you know from people that you trust. So keep that all in mind. So with that said, we can pop open all of this code here instead of Visual Studio Code. So this is what we downloaded for our role. And as you can see, there are a lot of files and folders inside of here, and this is a simple example. Starting from the top, we have defaults. So these are some variables that default the configuration of this role. And I'm already starting to see what this does here with get configuration to set the username and email address. Also set some color information, core values, pushing and aliasing. For example, setting up an alias of clone. I personally like GCL for a clone. This person likes CLO. So you can see you might conflict with some of the things that are in here. This defaults allows for some flexibility or variables, defaulting them for the configuration of this role for when it executes to configure your system so that you can override this to your liking. Next up is a meta folder. This is really just metadata about this role that is used to publish information to Galaxy. So you've seen a lot of this before, both the command line and in Galaxy, to show you what exactly this role does, hopefully. Hopefully this information is up to date. But that's why I say browse through the code, because the information might not be up to date. Tasks is a primary folder. Inside of here would be configuration, ignore, and main YAML files, it looks like. Main.yaml is something you want to look for commonly. You'll see it in a lot of the folders inside of a role. In a way, you could think of it as an entry point to that part of the role. So for tasks that this role is going to execute, just like our playbooks, you can see this is the high level to include tasks, to include two separate files, one for getconfig and one for getignore. That kind of makes sense from an organizational standpoint. You could also just roll all that together. So you can see here a nice way to split things out. And then inside of here, you can drill into each set of tasks. Very simple. One set of tasks here in this case, because we have included this. If you'd like, you could look at the documentation for what include does by just hovering over it with the VS Code extension installed. You can see we can include a play or a task list. Inside of that task for getconfig, we just run the template module, which is a lot like what we saw with the copy module. It just gives you a flexible starting point. So instead of a hard-coded file, you have a templated file that you start with as your source. And just like we did, it writes it out to the destination of the home directory's getconfig file. Inside the ignore file, we have our setup for our ignore. So adding our getignore files. Our source would be this getignore.j2 file, the Jinja file. It's a templating language. You can see these two files down here, getconfig.j2 and getignore.j2 inside the templates folder. You might also find a files folder if there's some hard-coded files to copy out, like we did. And these are just flexible templates. You'd have to understand the Jinja language to understand what they're doing, but they're more or less looping over the configuration we saw up in the defaults to spit out files for get configuration. Each of these happen to be sections, and then these are the key value pairs within the section. So name and email, just like we configured, and then these other settings. And then for getignore, this is just a list of things to ignore. So if we look at the getignore first, I think that'll be a little bit easier. It's just a loop over the items that are ignored and printing them out to the file, literally just printing them out into a blank file. The getconfig, we are looping over the sections, and for each section, we are taking the values for that section and breaking them out into key value pairs. We print out the section name. So for example, user, and then inside of there, we have name, and then the value for the name, email, and then the value for the email, etc. We loop over the sections, and then within that, we loop over the key value pairs. Just like we saw over in the configuration, you'll see up here at the top, getconfig, section, key value pair, section, key value pair, section, section, section. So that's their organization for this particular role. And then there's some tests. Now I am noticing a lot of flexibility in this particular role. I'm noticing a lot of variables. For example, in the ignore tasks, I noticed that the destination for the getignore file was a variable that is defined as a default up here of getExcludes file. That's neither here nor there what you do with that. I sometimes think too much flexibility can be a bad thing, so it's up to you what you do with it. If something's for you, you probably want to come closer to hard coding it, maybe a little bit less flexibility. If it's for other people or for yourself and you're changing it a lot, then flexibility makes sense. But don't put flexibility in just because you think you have to have it. It can make things very convoluted and very confusing. And then we just have a few extra files here. They're project-oriented files, including a README that you can put into preview mode with Shift-Command-V or Shift-Control-V in Visual Studio if you're using that to look through the usage of or notes that are left behind. And again, hopefully this is up to date. It may not be up to date. That's why I always encourage you to look at the files themselves for the role to see what they do, because if this is not up to date, the files will be up to date because they're the ones that are going to be executed, both from a security and a sanity standpoint of understanding what this role is going to do to your machines. But hey, we've got some example usage here. You can even see how easy it is to include this inside of a playbook. So let's briefly do that next.
Really, this next step is up to you how you execute it, but you should take the time to test out your role that you've discovered or collection or whatever package you've found. And this applies to any system of delivering content to reuse it.
And I prefer to do this in some sort of contained fashion first to make sure that things are safe and to make sure that things are doing what I think they're doing. And I really do believe that Docker is a great tool for testing this out quickly. And at the end of the day, starting with a clean environment to know exactly what changed when I execute, in this case, an Ansible role. So let's try that out. So I am over here on my terminal and I am going to execute a container. I'm not going to explain a lot here. If you don't understand Docker, I really would encourage you to take some time to study some of the basics of just launching containers and interacting with them, because you can do a lot with a very basic knowledge of Docker, especially when it comes to a tool like Ansible, where you might want to contained test some roles that you find on Galaxy to make sure that they're safe before you use them in your actual environment. So what I'm doing here is creating a container, a lot like a VM or a physical machine, an isolated environment, and I'm running a bash shell inside of it. It's got the Python image as its base, so it has the Python tooling available, which is great for Ansible, but it does not have Ansible installed, so that is one thing I'm going to have to add. So I'll quickly add pip install here in Ansible. And maybe one reason why I really recommend Docker is that it's super easy if I wanted to install a specific version of Ansible. So I could go back in time here to 2.7. I'm going to do this for a reason. I want to show you that collections that were added in 2.8, I want to show you what Ansible-Galaxy looked like just a few versions ago, which is a great way to learn about the evolution of the CLI as collections are added to it and understand maybe a little bit about the history of it. You can spin up containers, install old versions of software, throw them away when you're done, or maybe keep them around for testing purposes, whatever you see fit. In this case, I've installed Ansible version 2.7, and in a moment here, I will be able to run the ansible-galaxy command. I'll just grab the help for this real quick here to show you the difference in the output versus what we saw a moment ago on our own machine. So down below, I will run the Galaxy command and grab the help for that. And this is using a newer version of Galaxy as a part of Ansible 2.9.1, I believe I've got installed right now, versus 2.7 up above here. And you can see quite the difference in the output. We don't even have a mention of collections up above, whereas we have a mention of collections prominently down below. So one big benefit of containers is you can just run previous versions of software, which also means you could run previous versions of roles if you wanted to. But most importantly, you can run safely a role in a contained test environment. So now let's do that. So I can clear out this bottom screen here. That was just on my local Mac. And then I'm inside of a container that when I kill it, it will just be gone in the wind. And I can simply start up a new container this time. And I can do a pip install again. And this time I can install Ansible. And this will install the latest version of Ansible. All right, that is done installing now, so we should have Ansible available at the command line here. And notably, we should have the Galaxy command available. You can see we have 292 on here. And now that I'm in an isolated environment, I'm just going to change into the home directory for the root user here in this container. I can now bring down the role, in this case, that I would like to test. Quick quiz, do you remember how to do that? Run the ansible-galaxy command. In this case, we will do role and install. I can go ahead and paste in the role that I want to download. I've now got that in my environment here at root and then .ansible and then this path right here. You can see the contents of that looks very familiar. So now I will go ahead and make a directory for a quick test playbook. And inside of here, this will be our contained test. We will create that playbook. But to do that, I'm going to need some sort of editor. And right now I'm inside of a container that has no editors that I know of. So what I'm going to do is run apt update because I know this will work for this particular container image. Python is based on the Debian image, and so I can run apt to update my packages for the system, and I can run apt install here and put Vim on this system. Of course, I could probably use Ansible to do this too, but hey, I'll do this the old-fashioned way. Now I've got Vim on my system. I can hop on into a playbook. 3 dashes to denote the YAML file type. And then we just need to set up a play here in this case that will include that role. So we'll start out with just include our get config test role. We would need to map this to hosts, and so we'll specify localhost. And then last up, we need to specify the role. And we saw in the GitHub documentation, it's as simple as typing roles, and that's all I have to do to include that role then. I can go ahead and save my playbook. And now what do you think I do to run said playbook? So run the playbook command, pass in our playbook, and fire her up. Now, in this case, this will fail. This is a bit old of a role. And instead of changing it out, I thought, why not go ahead and show this failure when I was getting ready for this course? Because sometimes you are going to find roles that are a bit out of date. And you'll notice down here at the bottom is an explanation of what the problem is. And you'll see that it has to do with this iter items. And so if I just take that string here, hop over to my browser and paste that in, I might put in Ansible and failure. And you'll see the docs actually talk about this problem. And right here you can see that the dict.iterItems method was removed in Python 3. And here are two alternatives. So this role just needs to be updated if we were to use it. I'm not going to do that. I just wanted to show you how you can quickly get an environment up and running with a container to be able to test out a role. And in this case, confirm that the role out of the box does not work and would need a little bit of modification. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. We might need to fork the repository, make a few changes, or maybe we want to look for a different role. Okay, so back over in my container, all I have to do is exit out of it. And that container will be destroyed because when I created it, I passed a special flag that would remove it, rm, when I exit out of the bash process that I started up inside of it. And if everything went okay and you inspected your environment when you're done to see what changes have been made, so once we've run our contain test, we can go ahead and add it to our official or production playbooks or whatever environment we're going to use it in, maybe our developer workstation. This is the entirety of what I like to think of as the consumption side of the equation when it comes to using ansible-galaxy. Now there's a whole other side of ansible-galaxy that has to do with developing or publishing. So this is the flip side of things. Instead of consuming, we might want to produce our own roles that other people could use. So we looked at consuming, and then we had this other process here for developing. I like to distinguish this and start to think of the steps that are involved here. Now, I came up with these steps. These are my personal preferences. You could come up with your own different set of steps here that you could follow. I just wanted to give you a workflow for finding through to consuming and using a role. And then if you're interested in a future exploration, you could look at developing your own role and looking at, in that case, extracting out some tasks maybe that you have inside of a playbook, testing them, and then publishing them so you can use them and other people can use them. And then, of course, mollifying anybody's problems that they have with the role or collection that you've published to ansible-galaxy. And this is going to work the same with roles or collections, so I don't have to show you both. But know that collections are kind of the future of Ansible, it seems, at this point in time. So pay attention to changes in that domain. And with that, we have now reached the end of the course. I hope you have enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun putting it together. Ansible is a very complicated, deep topic, and a getting started course, as you can see here, takes quite a bit of time to get through, and we've only scratched the surface of what's possible. Hopefully you will take and run with this and use some of the tools that I've given you to further explore Ansible and apply it in ways that, like I said, low risk, high reward. So look for things that will benefit you and that are easy for you to pull off. Once you've done that, then you can take a little bit more risk, maybe move beyond your developer workstation into some sort of testing or staging environment, and then eventually into a production environment where you have a really high risk factor, but you also have a really high potential reward factor as well. So balance those out, risk and reward, and have at it. Take Ansible for a spin and see what it can do for you.